pivoting to movie theaters and production. These Jewish American entrepreneurs succeeded because motion pictures were widely popular, and Gentile industrialists largely wanted nothing to do with the business.
Jewish historian Neil Gabler writes, "From this point on, the Jews would control the movies." In the same year that the Jews took over Hollywood in 1915, the Supreme Court denied First Amendment rights to movies. This was the Mutual Film Corporation versus Industrial Commission of Ohio decision. Moving pictures would be a business, pure and simple. This decision gave local censors the right to screen movies before allowing their showing. Noticing that Jews were overrepresented in the film industry was out of bounds even back then. In 1922, the most popular anti-Hollywood pamphlet, The Sins of Hollywood, describes a movie producer who is preying on an aspiring actress as small, dark-haired with a bullet head and a low, receding brow, and a large nose and small, ratty eyes. It's pretty clear that the character is a Jew, given he also has a Yiddish-sounding accent, but it is never explicitly mentioned. Prominent American, Henry Ford, was willing to call out the overwhelming Jewish influence of motion pictures. He wrote 3 articles about Jews and the film industry in his newspaper, The Dearborn Independent, which he distributed for free. Their protests will be entirely useless until they realize that behind the movies, there is another group of definite moral and racial complexion. They can go on beating the air for a lifetime and still obtain no improvement unless they face the unpleasant racial fact that the movies are Jewish. It is not a question of morals. That question has been settled. It is a question of management. In 1921, there were 100 bills introduced in 37 states calling for the regulation of motion pictures. To prevent government crackdowns, the film industry hired U.S. Postmaster General Will Hayes to head the newly formed Motion Picture Association of America. The MPA would draw up guidelines until 1930, when the Hayes Code was established. However, it would not be enforced until 1934. These 4 years are known as the pre-code era, where movie producers pushed the moral boundaries of the time. Films showed spousal abuse, a woman sleeping her way up the corporate ladder, implied rape scenes, swimming scenes with underwater nudity, and even torture and necrophilia. In response, Catholics formed the League of Decency to stage boycotts. One boycott in Philadelphia dropped profits by 40%. Hayes would appoint the Irish Catholic Joseph Breen to start enforcing the Hayes Code. From his private correspondence, it is clear Breen was an anti-Semite. The Jews are a rotten bunch of vile people, with no respect for anything beyond the making of money. Here in Hollywood, we have paganism rampant, and in its most virulent form. Drunkenness and debauchery are commonplace. Sexual perversion is rampant. These Jews seem to think of nothing but making money and sexual indulgence. 95% of these folks are Jews of an Eastern European lineage. They are probably the scum of the earth. Breen and the Catholic Legion of Decency held the Jews at bay until 1948, when the Jew Joseph Burston imported a film from Italy called The Bicycle Thief. Breen wanted 2 scenes removed, a shot of a boy from behind, urinating on a wall, and another where characters are running through a brothel. No nudity was shown, but Breen argued that it was a slippery slope. He refuses to give it a seal of approval. Under pressure from the media, civil liberty organizations, and even the Legion of Decency, Breen backs down. 4 years later, Burston imports a controversial film called The Miracle. The plot of the movie is a peasant woman has a drunken encounter with a man she believes is Saint Joseph. She becomes convinced she has miraculously conceived and is carrying the child of God. Catholics try to block the blasphemous film, but Burston takes it to the Supreme Court and wins what is known as the Miracle Decision. This decision overturned the Mutual Decision, and now films were protected under the First Amendment. Jewish lawyer Ephraim London argues the Miracle case in 8 other films and wins them all. After the Miracle Decision, the Jew Otto Preminger submits the script for a film called The Moon is Blue. It is rejected by both the production code and the Legion for making it seem that premarital sex was commonplace in society.
Do you want to come with me? If you're seriously planning to embark upon a life of sin, I wouldn't attempt to dissuade you.
You wouldn't?
It would be very discreet, of course. wouldn't want your father to find out.
Preminger compares the film censors to Nazis in a press conference, a tactic that will be used again later. After both Paramount and Warner Brothers turn the film down, the Jewish owners of United Artists produce an unedited version of the film. It is banned in 3 states, one of them being Kansas. United Artists takes Kansas all the way to the Supreme Court, where Ephraim London succeeds in getting the decision reversed. Despite not being code approved, The Moon is Blue is successful, and this would signal the end for the Legion of Decency and the production code. Independent filmmakers would now push the boundaries with genres called nudie cutie and sexploitation films. The Jew David Friedman would create a new subgenre called Roughies with the film Scum of the Earth. Roughies involved a woman being violently raped, and then by the end, she gets her revenge. He also released the first of what is called gore, or splatter films, with Blood Feast. He even produced a subgenre known as Nazi-sploitation, with the films Love Camp 7 and Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS. These were sexually explicit, gory, over-the-top horror fantasies about cartoonish German Nazis conducting deranged experiments in concentration camps. In 1964, the Supreme Court had another landmark case over the French film The Lovers. Ephraim London again argued the case, applying the Roth test to the film. The Supreme Court ruled the film not obscene. Now, if any film had any redeeming social value, it could not be suppressed. Underground films were basically untouchable now, but Hollywood was still under the thumb of the production code and the Legion of Decency. A film about the Holocaust, 1964's The Pawnbroker, would start a series of events to eradicate the production code. The film is about a Holocaust survivor who owns a pawn shop in Harlem. In one scene, a black woman reveals her bare breasts to him, and it triggers a flashback to German soldiers stripping and raping his wife in a concentration camp. Although the Production Code Administration and the Legion were intimidated, they still rejected the film. The Jewish-owned Allied Artists would release the film anyway. An appeal was then put in to the MPAA. The board overturned the prior ruling, saying it was a special case and is in no way setting a precedent. This proved to be untrue and set off a series of events that completely dismantled the production code within 5 years. It would be replaced with the MPAA rating system that is still in use today. What is strange is that the dismantling of the code cost the film industry money. From 1965 to 1969, there was a loss of 2/3 of theatergoers. Also, G-rated films make an overwhelmingly larger return than R-rated films, yet producers make more R-rated ones. That is perhaps billions of dollars of profits out the window. Why? One would have to conclude that the Jews are more concerned with demoralizing society and pushing an agenda, more than they are with making profits. In 1965, the family-friendly film The Sound of Music won the Academy Award for Best Picture. Just 4 years later, the rated X film Midnight Cowboy would win. By 1972, the infamous hardcore porn film Deep Throat was a nationwide blockbuster. A backlash to these liberal excesses would sweep conservative Richard Nixon into power, and there would be a last-ditch effort to stem the tide of hardcore pornography.
I'd like to begin with a fact, a simple yet shocking fact. It is this: a flood tide of filth is engulfing our country in the form of newsstand obscenity and is threatening to pervert an entire generation of our American children. We know that once a person is perverted, it is practically impossible for that person to adjust to normal attitudes in regard to sex.
Explicit pornography had begun seeping up from the underground in the late 60s and early 70s. This was causing a nationwide controversy and led President Lyndon Johnson to assemble a commission on obscenity and pornography. Although claiming to be neutral, the commission was full of ACLU members, including the chairman. The final report claimed that not only is access to pornography not harmful to society, but it may be beneficial because it will make people more tolerant. The panel relied heavily on the findings of a single Danish Jew named Burl Kuczynski. Denmark had been the first country to legalize hardcore pornography in 1967. Kuczynski was commissioned to study the results, and he concluded that pornography was safe because sex crimes had decreased and not increased. The chief counsel of the commission, the Jew Paul Bender, would later go on to be an outspoken defender of child pornography. In 1977, he testified to a United States Senate committee that strict anti-child pornography laws are not morally justifiable, because the conclusion that child pornography causes child abuse involves too much speculation. Nixon would be elected president before the commission ends. The findings of the commission were overwhelmingly rejected by Congress. Nixon was well aware of who was behind the proliferation of pornography. In a tape-recorded conversation with Reverend Billy Graham, the most powerful preacher in the country, they blamed the Jews for pushing pornography.
The power media.
They've got it.
They got it right by.
And they're the ones putting out the pornographic stuff. You see, the Bible makes a distinction, Mr. President, between two groups of Jews. One is called the synagogue of Satan. In other words, they are energized by supernatural power called the devil. They have a strange brilliance about them.
Oh,
They're
smart.
They're smart. They have a stranglehold on Germany, on the banking of Germany, on everything in Germany, and the media. They had the whole thing, you see. But he went about it wrong. But this stranglehold has got to be broken, or this country is going to go down the drain.
You believe that?
Yes, sir.
I can't ever say it, but I believe it.
Nixon would appoint 4 conservative justices to the Supreme Court. An obscenity case finally arrives with Miller versus California. The defendant, again a Jew, named Marvin Miller, was convicted for mailing pornographic advertisements to random people in California. A mother had complained that her child opened the mail and viewed the pornography. Miller's conviction is upheld by the Supreme Court, and the Roth test would now be replaced with the Miller test. The Miller test solidified that the phrase community standards of the Roth test were not national, as previously interpreted, but meant local. The Miller test would put a stop to any more nationwide theatrical releases like Deep Throat. And authorities quickly moved on several high-profile pornographers, such as Al Goldstein. Goldstein ran the magazine Screw in New York. He beat 19 obscenity charges. Authorities would attempt to try Goldstein in the more conservative state of Kansas, using the now local standards. After 3 high-profile, very expensive trials, Wichita failed to get a conviction for Goldstein. Gender studies professor Whitney Strub wrote, "Miller seemingly made prosecutions easier, but in fact this cultural drift made convictions harder to obtain. Juries were tougher to shock, more reluctant to send people to prison for obscenity. A more liberal culture reigned in the more conservative doctrine." Another Jewish tactic was to force the courts to take the phrase appeals to the prurient interest literally, meaning it had to sexually stimulate the accuser. Goldstein wrote, "The big threat of obscenity was whether it appealed to prurient interest. Aside from being dirty, morbid, and offensive, the contents of Screw were only deemed criminal if it was sexy enough to, in the words of legalese, create an erection in a male or a moist vaginal area in a female. Put in the position of having to admit to a boner on the stand, expert Puritans waxed apoplectic. Thus, the prosecution would crumble."
What makes Al Goldstein? Al Goldstein's a f***ing legend. How many people legalize pornography? I changed the law. My f***ing arrest in Wichita, Kansas. I'm the one who's still convicted of showing pubic hair in 1971. I changed the f***ing law.
At the 1998 World Pornography Conference, Goldstein would say, "The only reason that Jews are in pornography is that we think that Christ sucks. Catholicism sucks. We don't believe in authoritarianism." There were 2 more unsuccessful, high-profile obscenity cases. One against the Gentile Larry Flynt for Hustler magazine,